Good morning. Te salud. Blessings to you all. It's just afternoon and I've just said the Angelus. Got my mug of amaretto coffee ready to go, and I've got my Shakespeare ready to go. Do a little bit of reading with you. A bit of discussion of Romeo and Juliet. So welcome. I hope everyone's doing well. Second week now of the lockdown here in the United States. And what is today? Today is the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth day of spring or fifth day of spring. Anyway, we're in spring and it's gray and it's cold in Minnesota. So, there it is. But thanks be to God, we are all doing well so far, and I hope your household is doing well as well. Hello, Nick Chalmers. Welcome to you. Up to now, I haven't talked about the Renaissance at all with Shakespeare, and I would be somewhat remiss if I didn't speak about the Renaissance with you because, of course, Shakespeare is frequently referred to as one of those Renaissance poets. So I'm going to try to be brief. Always an issue with me. But the Renaissance it's a movement in history, but it's not like, here's the Renaissance, here's the end of Renaissance. Renaissance is a movement where does it begin, where does it end? We know for sure that if we're going to tag the Renaissance period, it's roughly between the 1400s and 1500s. Okay, about the middle of the 1400s is where it really takes off, and the end of the 1500s, it's coming to its conclusion. So Shakespeare is writing right at the end of the Renaissance. He's a late Renaissance writer. If anything, we're going to say that the Renaissance began somewhere around the time of the poet Petrarch. Petrarch was writing at the early part of the 1300s, and he's sort of the father of the Renaissance. He's referred to frequently. I like to suggest that the Renaissance actually, if you were to look at a point where the Renaissance really begins, there's an event where the artists were bidding to create these doors for the Florentine cathedral, the cathedral in Florence. And in 1401, a fellow by the name of Ghiberti won this contest against another fellow by the name of Brunelleschi. And Ghiberti's doors are a distinct moment in history because they show a style of artwork that is unique, that's different from art that came before. And so 1401, you could say, that's kind of where the Renaissance begins. Bob Stevenson, how are you? Denise Hurl, how are you? Good morning, Michelle Magrino. So you all are coming up and just want to wave to you all. Shout out. Now, if you're looking for an end point for the Renaissance, really the end of the Renaissance, at the beginning of the Renaissance is about 1401, right, 1400, with the doors of the Florentine cathedral. And I'll get into why that is at all significant in a minute. The end of the Renaissance, we're looking at roughly 1640, okay, because in the 1640s, you have 1648 is the end of the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War with the Treaty of Westphalia ended a conflict in Europe that decimated the landscape. It just destroyed the landscape. And this was a moment where it was like the shift in culture had moved away from this brilliance of the Renaissance and started to move into modernity, which then became the Enlightenment movement in the 1700s. So really, we're looking, the Renaissance falls between the 1400s and the 1600s, about a 200-year period. Now, a man, Shakespeare, he's writing in the 1590s. His career goes roughly from the 1580s to about 1600s, early 1600s. So he's writing right at the end of this Renaissance thing. Now, what is the Renaissance? If most people have heard of the Renaissance before, and when we talk about the Renaissance, we're talking about that period there between the 1400s and the 1500s, in Europe, which was primarily located in Italy, though there was a Renaissance movement, of course, in France and Germany and England as well. There were prior Renaissances. There's the Renaissance of the 800s, which is the Charlemagne Renaissance, and there were Renaissances in other cultures as well. But really, when we say the Renaissance, we mean that period there in Europe where these great men, these great artists developed. So instead of just saying the Renaissance of the 14 and 1500s, we'll just say the Renaissance and get it over with and say, well, that's what we're talking about. Now, in that period of time, the Renaissance, what is that? The Renaissance is really, it's a artistic and cultural and political movement that occurs in Europe. The old system of the medieval world had relied on a structure that was Platonic. That is, it went from top down. God anointing kings, anointing dukes. And a lot of the medieval world was recovery from the fall after Rome in the 400s. The medieval world was a highly structured world, and it was focused primarily on those things of the next world, the things of God, the things of that structural pattern of the Logos. It did have artistic movements and some political movements that were focused on the individual, but most of the focus of the medieval world was on the greatness of the structure of the next world, the structure of God's structure. So the movement that occurred in the Renaissance, the renewal, is what that word means, Renaissance. The renewal was essentially about a renewal of a classical vision. And it was focused primarily on the individual human person. And if we were to say anything that distinguished this movement particularly, it was the emphasis on what was called humanism. Humanism now has kind of got a bad rap because we talk about secular humanism, which is a focus on human beings without any connection to the divine realm. But humanism itself in the Renaissance, I don't know if it really was something which could be tagged badly in that same way. Humanism in the Renaissance was more an emphasis on all that was good about humanity. It was a turning away from the structure that was focused on God's plan and God's structure of the Logos towards what could human beings do that was truly great and truly magnificent. Kept the same kind of mathematical structure that the medievals had seen, kept the same kind of artistic emphasis and the same kind of production that the medievals had seen, but the shift was far more towards focusing on naturalism, focusing on the human form, focusing on classical idioms of all kinds in art. And so humanism really is that emphasis on all that's great about humanity. And that, if nothing else, that's the main thing I think that you could say the Renaissance is punctuated by. It's the distinguishing mark of the Renaissance, that human life, human culture, human creation is something to be exalted. You go back to a saying by the artist Protagoras, which is that man is the measure of all things. And we keep that in mind when we talk about humanism and the Renaissance. Man is the measure of all things. Not God's structure, man's structure. Now, for those of you who have followed along, this really does reflect a great deal of what was going on in the scholastic movement before, too. By the way, hello, Bert. Good to see you. Or at least to text you, to read you. Oh, and by the way, the roaring in the background, that's my kids playing Halo out on the porch. And they like to roar and scream at the TV. So I section them off and seal them off in an isolated chamber where hopefully the noise is contained so my wife can work and I can do these sorts of things. So if you hear any roaring in the background, it's not animals, it's just my kids going bananas. So I'll deal with them later. If we look at the scholastic problem was a difference between those who held to a Platonic worldview, which was the Logos descending into individuated forms, and an Aristotelian worldview, which was individuals then extracting to make a generalization that we dealt with the world through. And really the shift occurs in the Renaissance towards a more Aristotelian worldview. And that makes sense because, of course, Aristotle's works, having become prominent in the 1200s, then were even more prominent in the 1300s. And don't we all, Bert? And that same kind of emphasis we see in the Renaissance was an emphasis that Aristotle really was keen on as well. So you could say that the Renaissance had a lot to do with that debate that had occurred between the Platonic and Aristotelian worldview. Another thing, if you want to say, why did this movement begin? Again, there's no like distinguishing moment, like a moment where we say, hey, now we're doing the Renaissance and we're stopping the Gothic thing. That doesn't happen. It's more there's this gradual sea change that occurs in Europe over time, and they're distinguishing marks that kind of say, well, this is different or that's different. And like I said, the first really distinct thing I would put as those doors of the Florentine Cathedral. But what contributed to this movement? What caused this movement to occur? I really think it was a lot to do with the disaster of the 1300s. You had the papal shift to Avignon, which really struck people's sentiments in terms of religious security. You had the famine of the 1315, the starvation that occurred in 1315, and the world cooling that preceded that. You had the Black Plague that came in 1345 and decimated or took out a third of the population of Europe. You had the 100 Years' War. You had the War of the Roses extending into the 1400s. So all these different things that occurred in the 1300s that were really horrific to the population, I think changed their worldview. Hello, Lacey. In a similar mode, if you look even now, we've been a week here in America on a lockdown, and you could already see a shift occurring to some degree. Now, if you imagine, take that lockdown and extend it for about 100 years. That is really tough to get your mind around. If you look at like 4 generations growing up in a similarly difficult era to live in, by the end of those 100 years, you would have a culture that had changed a great deal, that had abandoned some of its ideas, modified some of its ideas, and had dropped some and adopted others. And I really think that's what contributes to the Renaissance movement more than anything else. Those issues that occurred in Europe caused a shift in the way people saw the world, for better or for worse, okay, but it caused a shift. And I think that shift was one of questioning what kind of God would allow these awful things to happen. And instead of saying there is no God, although there were those who did during the 1400s, they said, let's not talk about God in the same way. Let's not talk about that structure of the world in the same way. And that's why they began focusing, I think, on more natural themes and on focusing on the classical world that had lasted for so long prior to the Christian realm. Now, that being said, there are positive things that contribute to this development as well. One of them is the increased trade that occurs, because after the Black Death had wiped out so many people, there was a distinct shift in land ownership, and there was a distinct shift in the types of trade that was occurring, because you had fewer people, but you had people where the wealth was more concentrated, and so they could purchase more. And that purchasing power caused more trade to actually develop throughout Europe. And there were certain families that gained great prominence and wealth within their communities. But at the same time that they gained great prominence and wealth, they also developed into city-states. Whereas before, back during the Roman era and even during the medieval era, you had Christendom. You had an empire, really. And you had an empire of the Franks, or you had the Papal States. During the time of the 1300s, people got more cloistered. Again, partly because of fear, partly because of the breakdown of society. So they began to develop not these kingdoms so much as city-states, where a single city became a country in and of itself. And if you've ever been to Europe, and especially in Italy, you'll see this, because You go to a place like, I remember going to Palestrina, where Giovanni Pier de Luigi Palestrina grew up, and you can see there in Palestrina, it's a fortress. The whole city is this fortress on a hill. Same thing with Assisi. If you've ever been to Assisi, where Francis had his church, it's a fortress on a hill. And that fortress would have been able to withstand anything like riots or attacks or anything that had happened in the countryside around it. It could withstand it, and so it became this kind of isolated city. You see a similar thing happening in places like Florence, for instance, or in Venice to the north in Italy. All these different cities became entities in and of themselves who were trade entities, but were also fortress mentality entities. That's why, for instance, in our story, Romeo and Juliet, you have those warring families of Capulet and Montague, because they had developed their trade based upon primarily the change or shift in politics and economics that had occurred in the 1300s during that disaster of the Black Death and the famine and the warfare. Now, during this time period, those great families that rose to prominence then began competing with one another for fame and glory and power. Because, of course, if you get fame, glory, and power, you get to put your brand on whatever it is that you get to create. And you go all through Europe and you see the brand of certain families is very prominent on a lot of these structures, a lot of these sculptures, a lot of these pieces of architecture. Hello, Angelica. And I think that when they were giving money to these artists and these poets and these architects, they were doing so partly because they were supporting the arts because they loved the arts, but also because they were gaining prominence as a brand, as a product, right, as a company. One of the greatest of those was the Medici family, and the Medicis were a banking family and a wool family, if memory serves, that was located in Florence. And this is why those doors that I mentioned originally, 1401, those bronze doors of the cathedral there in Florence were very important, not just because they showed all the structural patterns of the new art form, but because they were financed by the Medici family. The Medicis gave money to these guys in this contest, and it kind of signified the beginning of it's not an arms race, it's an arts race. They began this art race where people would actually compete to get the money from these great families, and therefore you had competition that allowed great men to come to prominence. And that's where we get people like Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, and Michelangelo Buonarroti, and Raphael, for instance, and all these other great, Brunelleschi, right? All these other great artists rose to prominence because they were like rock stars. They were highly prized by these powerful political men. They got a lot of money from these powerful political men. And when you went to Florence and you looked at the dome and you say, oh, that's the work of so-and-so, Brunelleschi, right? That's his work. And so they became very popular, very important. This is significant in Renaissance because in the medieval era, that didn't happen. In the medieval era, actually, the major patrons were the church, and not so much the powerful families. And the church, when it was paying for these great artists to develop places like the cathedrals and the like, those artists remained to a great degree anonymous. We have composers of the medieval era in abundance, but many of them have no name. They are like the master of such and such, the Meister de Capella of such and such cathedral, but they don't have names like Michelangelo, right? They don't stand out in that way. So another distinguishing mark of the Renaissance is that you get these rock stars, these prominent men who became very important as artists. During this period of time, then you have certain developments that occurred in the Renaissance. Perspective, for instance, is not invented, it's renewed. The idea of perspective was not used during the medieval era. We do see perspective earlier in Greek art and even in Egyptian art to some degree. So it's not like people were standing around saying, "Oh, the world's flat," and then all of a sudden, bang! Oh, let's draw it like three-dimensional. It's rather that this idea was renewed and revivified in the artistic patterns of the Renaissance. Perspective is merely an artistic illusion that makes a piece of two-dimensional art look as though it were three-dimensional. And frequently the illusion was really capitalized on, and they would make a scene of the Virgin Mary with the angel, and outside of the window you'd see another scene out there in the landscape, or you'd have this illusion where if you looked up at the thing, it was drawn in such a way that all the characters looked like they were looming over you or what have you. So Renaissance art then took that perspective and created paintings that were like an illusion, like another world, so realistic that it looked like you could step into the painting itself. That's important. I'll come back to that in just a minute. A naturalism is a distinguishing mark of Renaissance art. The secular themes, classical themes. You also had invention of certain tools, like concrete was rediscovered during the Renaissance. It seems weird to us, but concrete wasn't really used during the medieval era. Concrete was a Roman invention, and it came back during the Renaissance and allowed for a lot of architectural buildings that didn't exist before or couldn't exist before. Another major invention was the printing press. And it's not that the printing press was invented, it's that this fellow invented what's called movable type in the printing press. And this is an invention which allows for the printing of different texts very quickly. The Chinese have been using the printing press for years, but they would carve a whole block and then, like that. Whereas the invention of movable type in the printing press basically allowed for quick movement of letters so you could print a number of different texts. And this is done by a guy named Gutenberg. And Gutenberg allowed for the printing of not just local texts, but also classical texts. Whereas before you had these classical texts that had to be written out, hand-scribed, and that's what Charlemagne's people did in the 800s. Gutenberg's new printing business allowed him to move in different letters and then print very quickly works of Aristotle and of Plato and of others that then other people could access. And that allowed for a proliferation of knowledge that didn't exist before. Hello, Joe. So the printing press is very important because it allows for a culture that before was, people like to say, illiterate. I think the medieval, a better term is that they were a non-literate culture, because illiterate is like they were stupid. That's the sort of the connotation with that word. The medievals weren't stupid. They were literate in a different way. And they did not actually read on a regular basis letters because that wasn't available to them. They were extremely good, though, with learning things that were visual culture, artistic ideas and stories, and also very, very good when it came to the law and learning terms in the law, memorizing terms in the law. Even peasants were very good at memorizing terms in the law. If you want to see a really good program on this, I highly suggest Terry Gilliam on YouTube. He does a really good series called Medieval Lives. And it's an eye-opening series where you find out a great deal more about the medievals than you thought you knew. Terry Gilliam's Medieval Lives suggests that the peasants even of the medieval era were not illiterate, they were non-literate. That is, that they didn't read texts on a regular basis because they simply weren't available. With the Gutenberg press, suddenly you get a lot of texts that are available, and people begin reading them on a far more regular basis than they did before. But the other thing that contributed to that invention, which is a culture-changing invention, was something which, if you want to see another good series, there's a series called Connections. And in Connections, the series suggests that when all these people died in the 1300s, they left not just land behind, but possessions. And among those possessions were heaps of clothing. And what do you do with all that clothing? Well, what ends up happening is you've got a lot of clothing that then gets boiled down and made into a paste, and the paste gets poured into a sheet and dried, and you have, for the first time, printing paper made out of cotton clothing, which really hadn't been done before, because all that cotton was going into the making of clothing. When you had this depleted populace and all of a sudden you didn't have the demand for clothing, paper began to be the thing that was produced. And paper produced at the same time that the printing press with the movable type was invented, made at the same time roughly that these new texts were coming back into Europe, made for an explosive moment in human history where suddenly you have not just the text to be disseminated, but the means to disseminate them. And that allowed for the Renaissance to take off with all this great information. Hello, Dan, and hello, Katie. Good to text you both or see you both. Now, I want to go back for a minute here to this idea of the perspective, because this comes up very much in Shakespeare's work. I read a great article several years ago. I wish I could find it, and if I do, I'll post it. It was in the magazine World and I, which talked about the decline in the Renaissance. The Renaissance started off as this beautiful movement, a movement which really exalted the human person and exalted the works of humanity. And one of those exaltations you see in the use of perspective. But as the Renaissance progressed, certain things happened that were not so very nice. There was the split from Rome by Henry VIII, for instance, in the 1500s. There was the sacking of Rome by the German army, and I think that was 1525, I think it was. And then there was again, the plague, which came back a couple of times. And as the Renaissance progressed, it became kind of clear that this movement of trying to revivify society wasn't making as good headway as people thought it would. And people began to get a little disillusioned about how good things could actually be. And you had a guy named Machiavelli who was writing roughly during this time too, and he wrote that when things go bad, you have to have a man who is strong and can lead people and who uses everything at his disposal in order to maintain control. And that book that he wrote, called The Prince, became a pivotal work in understanding politics and understanding the structure of government in a whole new way. But it's a cynical book. It's a book which I think you can see as really abandoning the idea that God leads us, that the idea that the structure of government comes from God's anointing of the king down. Suddenly you've got, we're on our own, in a way, Machiavelli suggests. And we're on our own such that most people panic, most people run amok, and they need somebody to control them, to lead them, to take care of them. And that person has to be strong and ruthless and duplicitous. And that's, I think, a very disillusioning element. Shakespeare seems to have been familiar with Machiavelli, and he seems to have embodied him in certain characters like Henry V. Shakespeare is also aware of this idea of perspective, which this article in The World and I, which mentions Niccolo Machiavelli, this article was also mentioning that perspective began to create in the minds of the Europeans this idea that if you can create an illusory world in painting, how do we know that this world is not itself illusion? That's a startling thing to realize was already being contemplated in the 1500s. Because of those of you who grew up in the 90s and the aughts, remember the movie The Matrix. And you remember that in The Matrix, that's exactly what's suggested. How do you know that what is around you is not some elaborate illusion that is duping you into being nothing more than a Duracell battery? Now, in my opinion, that's poppycock. It's you can't live your life trying to figure that one out because you'll end up just spiraling out of control. But it seems to have been something which is not limited to the 1990s and the 2000s. The people in the 1500s, especially the later 1500s, were already considering this possibility. And their fear that they were living in an illusion was really exacerbated by this artistic construction of perspective. Perspective created such an amazingly convincing illusion of another world that it was as though you could step into that world through the painting. And if you could, how do you know that this world is real? And when you read Hamlet by Shakespeare, that is a very important point. Hamlet himself is struggling with this idea, this issue. Is this world that we deal with really real? Is it a reality? That same issue goes on to prominence in the 1600s with a guy named René Descartes. And René Descartes, who's a mathematician, is also considering this very same problem. And he actually ends up suggesting that the only way that I know how this world is real is because there's something in here that is registering the thinking process, is registering the recognition process. And that's why Descartes has a famous phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I exist, I am. In other words, the very fact that I think means that I exist. And that even if this world around us is total illusion, I know that I exist. Which seems like an elegant solution, but it's a complete reversal, an utter reversal of what the medievals were doing back with Thomas Aquinas. Because Thomas Aquinas was suggesting, because God exists, therefore I know that I do. That's what the Summa suggests. And even if you go further back, Euclid in his Elements is suggesting a similar thing. That because there's that point, everything else in mathematics can come from it. By the time you get to Descartes in the 1600s, this problem of illusion is very prominent, and Descartes has completely flipped the thing on its head. And that kind of opens the door for modernity. So if you look at the opening of the modern world and the opening of the Enlightenment world, it's kind of right around that time of Descartes. And Descartes is responding to this problem, which came up in the 1500s, which was the problem of perspective and illusion, which Shakespeare tackles as well, by the way. Okay. So, in sum, the Renaissance is a movement between the 1400s and 1500s. It's punctuated by the idea of humanism, which is an emphasis on humanity and the goodness of humans. Shakespeare is writing near the end of the Renaissance in the 1590s and the early 1600s, and he's displaying all those issues that have risen from the Renaissance. And that's where we are when we read this quote-unquote love story, which isn't a love story, of Romeo and Juliet, which I've been reading up till now as a interpretation, if you will, of the scholastic debate between the nominalists and the realists. In this scene, which is Act 1, Scene 4, we're going to get a famous speech called the Queen Mab speech. And it's a speech which a lot of people have problems with. They don't understand it frequently. They say, why is this in this play? It seems superfluous. And it's a hard one to stage, I think, because it doesn't fit with the whole preconceived notion that this is a love story. But if one doesn't read it as a love story, the Queen Mab speech makes perfect sense, and I can try and explain that when we get to the end. So here we go. We're reading Act 1, Scene 4, Romeo and Juliet. If you have your copy with you, read along with me, okay? All the young fellas are going off to a party that's being hosted by Lord Capulet. And remember that the Montagues of Romeo and his friend Benvolio and others have decided to crash the party. They're all wearing masks in the typical Venetian style, and they are planning to crash the party to check out all the cute girls and see if anybody is more willing than Rosaline to spend time with brooding Romeo. So here we go. Act 1, Scene 4, a street. Enter Romeo, Mercutio, Benvolio with 5 or 6 other maskers and torch-bearers. Romeo. What? Shall the speech be spoke for our excuse, or shall we on without apology? Benvolio. The date is out of such prolixity. We'll have no Cupid hoodwinked with a scarf, bearing a Tartar's painted bow of lath, scaring the ladies like a crow-keeper, nor no without-book prologue, faintly spoke after the prompter for our entrance. But let them measure us by what they will. We'll measure them a measure, and be gone. Romeo responds, Give me a torch. I am not for this ambling. Being but heavy, I will bear the light. And Mercutio, Nay, gentle Romeo, we must have you dance. Not I, believe me. You have dancing shoes with nimble soles. I have a soul of lead, so stakes me to the ground I cannot move. You are a lover, says Mercutio. Borrow Cupid's wings, and soar with them above a common bound. I am too sore and pierced with his shaft to soar with his light feathers, and so bound. I cannot bound a pitch above dull woe. Under love's heavy burden do I sink. And to sink in it should you burden love to great oppression for a tender thing. Is love a tender thing, Mercutio? It is too rough, too rude, too boisterous, and it pricks like them. If love be rough with you, be rough with love. Prick love for pricking, and you beat love down. Give me a case to put my visage in. A visor for a visor. What care I what curious eye doth quote deformities? Here the beetle brows shall blush for me. Come, says Benvolio, knock and enter, and no sooner in, but every man betake him to his legs. Romeo, a torch for me. Let wantons light of heart tickle the senseless rushes with their heels. I am proverbed with a grandsire phrase. I'll be a candle holder and look on. The game was ne'er so fair, and I am done. Mercutio. Tut! Done's the mouse, the constable's own word. If thou art done, we'll draw thee from the mire of this Sir Reverence love, wherein thou stick'st up to the ears. Come, we burn daylight. Oh, nay, that's not so. I mean, sir, in delay. We waste our lights in vain, like lamps by day. Take our good meaning for our judgment sits 5 times in that, once in our 5 wits. And we mean well in going to this mask, but 'tis no wit to go. Why, may one ask? I dreamt a dream tonight. Huh, and so did I. Well, what was yours? That dreamers often lie. In bed asleep, while they do dream things true. Oh, then I see Queen Mab hath been with you. She is the fairy's midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomies athwart men's noses as they lie asleep. Her wagon spokes made of long spinners' legs, the cover of the wings of grasshoppers, her traces of the smallest spiders' webs, her collar of the moonshine's watery beams, her whip of cricket's bone, the lash of film, her wagoner a small gray-coated gnat, not half so big as a round little worm pricked from the lazy finger of a maid. Her chariot is an empty hazelnut made by the joiner squirrel or old grub, time out of mindless fairies coachmakers. And in this state she gallops night by night through lovers' brains, and then they do dream of love. Or courtiers' knees that dream on courtiers straight, or lawyers' fingers who straight dream on fees, or ladies' lips who straight on kisses dream, which oft the angry Mab with blisters plagues, because their breasts with sweetmeats tainted are. Sometimes she gallops o'er a courtier's nose, and then dreams he of smelling out a suit. Sometimes comes she with a little tithe-pig's tail, tickling a parson's nose as he lies asleep, then dreams he of another benefice. Sometimes she driveth o'er a soldier's neck, and then dreams he of cutting foreign throats, of breaches and ambuscados, Spanish blades, of hell's 5 fathom deep, and then anon drums in his ear, at which he starts and wakes, and being thus frighted, swears a prayer or two, and sleeps again. This is that very Mab that plats the manes of horses in the night, and bakes the elf locks in foul sluttish hairs, which once untangled much misfortune bodes. This is the hag, when maids lie on their backs, it presses them and learns them first to bear, making them women of good carriage. This is she. Peace, peace, Mercutio, peace. Thou talkest of nothing. True. I talk of dreams, which are the children of an idle brain, begot of nothing but vain fantasy, which is as thin of substance as the air, and more inconstant than the wind, who woos even now the frozen bosom of the north, and being angered, puffs away from thence, and turning his face to the dew-dropping south. This wind you talk of blows us from ourselves. Supper is done, and we shall come too late, says Benvolio. I fear too early, for my mind misgives some consequence, yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term of a despised life closed in my breast by some vile forfeit of untimely death. But he that hath the steerage of my course, direct my sail. On, lusty gentlemen. Strike! Drum! Ex eunt. They all leave. I want to unpack it just a little bit because, again, that speech of Queen Mab, the Queen Mab speech, is a little tricky. But first, to note that a carryover from the previous scene, when we first met Romeo, whose name means pilgrim, is not some handsome, dashing, shallow youth. He's actually, I think, more like the Hamlet character of the play that later on Shakespeare will write. Romeo is somebody who's brooding and brooding and brooding. And he has this emptiness inside him, which he thinks will be filled up by finding some good woman to have with him. And he's wrong in that, but that's where he's focused. And he's really brooding, I think, over this issue of whether or not there's meaning to life. And that's why he's a pilgrim. He's searching for meaning. He's somebody who is trying to reach that source of meaning which Rome seems to have represented. Quick shout out. Hello, Mr. Jones. Hello, Sarah. Hello, Christina. Good day to you. Now, that being said, Romeo doesn't want to go to this party because of this brooding nature, this nature that doesn't really want to associate with other humans. Kind of an emo, He locks himself in his room and doesn't want to come out. And Benvolio is trying to get him to go in order that he sees other girls and sees how insignificant his own attachment is to Rosalind, and that he might find somebody else to love. So Benvolio, the man of goodwill, Benvolio, is seeking to get Romeo to attach himself to another girl. And we get, for the first time in the play, the character Mercutio. Right? Now, Mercutio, if I'm not mistaken, is mentioned earlier, back at Act 1, Scene 2. He's mentioned in the letter that goes out from Capulet to invite people to the party. Mercutio is the brother of a guy named Valentine. And we learn elsewhere that Mercutio is related to the prince, the ruler of the city. So he's not a Montague. He's not a Capulet. He's actually somebody who's related to the leader of the city, the main family in the city. Mercutio, though, the name, is a form of Mercury, and therefore he is a Roman form of the god Hermes. Hermes was the god not just of the messengers of the gods, he was also the guide for travelers and pilgrims. He was also the guy who led people to the underworld after they died. He was also in his form of what's called Hermes Trismegistos, he is the guide for knowledge and thought, especially knowledge and thought about the Logos, about the order of the universe. So the name Mercutio carries a lot of baggage with it. And here we find Mercutio, he's often played in productions I've seen as this kind of intense fool, or as this slightly effeminate character, as the Baz Luhrmann version does, or he's portrayed as a guy who knows a little more than other people and is dissatisfied with the world. I think that perhaps those are legitimate interpretations, because certainly Mercutio seems to be somebody who is different from the rest of the gang, the Montague gang. But Mercutio is, if we take him as the guide, he is the guide of Romeo. He's somebody who guides Romeo, or should be guiding Romeo in a certain way. And he says here to Romeo, why don't you just come to the party? Stop thinking these deep thoughts and just come to the party. Live an ordinary life, so to speak. Stop brooding over stuff. And Romeo says, I don't know if I want to go to the party because I had a prophetic dream. And that's where Mercutio diverts him, says, oh yeah, I had a dream too. And Romeo asks him, well, what was your dream? And Mercutio makes a joke of it. Dreamers often lie. But like most of Shakespeare's lines, there's a double meaning to that phrase. Dreamers often lie. On the one hand, when you're dreaming, you're asleep. And so you're lying down. Ha ha ha, funny. But on the other hand, if you're a dreamer, that is one who longs for the afterlife, one who longs for the source of truth, if you're a dreamer, Mercutio suggests, you are a liar. Why? Because there is no afterlife. There is no greater thing than this world, according to Mercutio. Mercutio seems to suggest that to hunt for that otherworldliness is itself a lie. It's a fable. It's diverting you from the job you have in this world right in front of you. But then Romeo takes it in the first instance and says, in bed asleep while they do dream things true. Right? So that Romeo takes it and converts it back to its original sense. And he says, yeah, but the dreams they have are very true things. And that's when Mercutio goes into this very long speech about Queen Mab. And it's really a discussion more about whether or not the ideas we have about honor and truth and beauty and goodness and a better world, are they real? Or are they simply lies that are sent to us? Are they real things, or are they part of an illusionary world which we can't ever actually get to? And Mercutio's Queen Mab speech is all about how there's this character, Queen Mab, who comes to people and inspires them to greatness, really. He inspires lawyers to seek out new cases, and inspires soldiers to great acts of daring do, and inspires preachers to gain great wealth through preaching. So Queen Mab, he suggests, is the character that gives to us all these images and ideas that propel us forwards in life, our hopes and our dreams, so to speak. Queen Mab is that very gal, that very character, who comes and plaits the manes of horses in the night and bakes the elf locks in foul, sluttish hairs, which once entangled much misfortune bodes. Right? She is the character that creates a tangle out of the world, and we follow that tangle and we get enmeshed in it. The character of Mab, or Maeve, is a character out of Irish mythology, out of Celtic mythology. And Maeve was a sorceress who had contact with the world of Fairy, of the other world. And so she was constantly channeling the world of Fairy into this world and causing problems for the mortals all the time. She shows up in Arthurian mythology in the form of Morgana Le Fay. So Maeve and Morgana they're synonymous characters. And if you know anything about Arthurian literature, Morgana Le Fay was part of the downfall of the Camelot, but she's also part of the creation of Camelot simultaneously. So this Queen Mab speech, it's really about where do we get our hopes and our dreams that inspire us to do anything great in life? What is it that separates you and I, for instance, from the common chimpanzee or from the squirrels? Why is it that we desire to do things and make things and accomplish things? Well, this speech of Queen Mab seems to suggest that it's all given to us by this force or this power that creates the tangle in our minds that then we're searching for. But it is, Mercutio seems to suggest, illusory. It's illusion. The source of our inspiration is itself illusion. And when Romeo cuts him off, because he goes a little nuts, right? He's a little nuts. And he starts ranting about who who this character is, how this character causes even women to desire a child and thus to become great with child, become women of good carriage. That families themselves are created through this desire for something which is illusory, which doesn't actually exist. And Romeo says, hey, Mercutio, you're going bananas again. Peace. Okay? You talk of nothing. And Romeo seems to suggest that right now you're ranting. But Mercutio pauses and he says, right, I am talking of nothing because I'm talking about dreams and hopes and desires. And for Mercutio, those dreams and hopes and desires are a nothingness. There's nothing there. And they are children of an idle brain, right, he says. Now, I wonder about this. He says there are things that are puffed away by the first air that comes along. I wonder about this, whether Mercutio is really cynical and saying that these things are nothingness, or whether because his experience has taught him to do so, he's putting up a mask. I mean, remember, they're going to a party in masks already. So is it possible that Mercutio is putting on a mask here? Is it possible that the mask began to come off in that Queen Mab speech, and when he realized other people were looking at him, he put the mask back on? Is it possible that Mercutio's whole life is one that is spent keeping his thoughts to himself because he knows that to share them with others is to cause his own downfall? I mean, think about for a minute what happens when people in the beginning of the play express their emotions and opinions directly. Do you bite your thumb, sir? That results in violence and carnage throughout the city. Mercutio, who's seen this, who's seen what happens when you express your ideas and thoughts, recognizes that you need a mask. You need to wear a shield to keep you from that violence that is inherent in the human existence. And that if you're going to pursue hopes and dreams, or if you're going to pursue the source of why we do what we do, you do it alone. You do it without being able to reveal what you're doing to anybody else. And I find that highly ironic because, of course, if he is the guide, if Mercutio is the guide, how is he supposed to guide Romeo when he has a mask even with Romeo and tries to keep Romeo out from his inner thoughts? I think it's part of the irony of the play. And I think it's also part of the irony of the play that when Romeo gets diverted by his affection for Juliet, he stops being the person that Mercutio needs to guide. And that's when, not to let the cat out of the bag, that's when Mercutio's life takes a different turn. And then we end the scene here with Romeo saying, I have deep misgivings about going forward, mainly because, as he says, there's some consequence yet hanging in the stars, right? That the astrological thing is pressing me. And I have the sense that going forward now is going to create something momentous. And that's why he says, whatever's happening shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels. What's about to happen to me, Romeo says, is going to be fearful. And it's going to begin with my going to this party. Now, if we're looking at it as a romance, a nice sweet romance, Romeo himself recognizes that what's about to happen is not romance. It's something fearful, dreadful, difficult, dangerous, lethal. And that's why he doesn't want to go to the party to even begin what he sees as something that's going to destroy him and others. But, he says, he that hath the steerage of my course direct my sail. And the he is capitalized here, at least in my copy it is. He that hath steerage of my course direct my sail. Who is that he? Who do you make that to be? Is the he capitalized as in the Lord, as in God? Is Romeo simply submitting to fate? Is the he Romeo, as in like a split thing going on, a split personality? Romeo's like, I can't control myself. Is the he some person there at the party, or is it fate itself? It's a very interesting line. He that hath the steerage of my course direct my sail. And he finds himself propelled almost against his will towards this fate that he sees as so dangerous. A concept, by the way, which is really the concept of the classical gods, because the classical gods, that's the idea that we are propelled by forces beyond our control to do certain things that we don't always want to do. Different from the Christian God, because the Christian God doesn't propel us towards some fate. The Christian God loves us and has this plan for us that works towards our good. But when we stop believing in a God that is beneficent, a God that is providential, we fall back into believing, even if we don't recognize it, fall back into believing that there are these forces or powers that push us without our being able to control them. And in some ways, it seems to suggest in the text that Romeo is beginning to move towards an abandonment of the idea of providence as a pilgrim towards Rome, and a submission to powers or forces or fortunes that propel him towards disaster. Not terribly romantic so far, I gotta say. That ends Scene 4. And hopefully, God willing, we'll pick up Act 1, Scene 5 tomorrow. Thank you all so much. If you had questions or ideas or comments, please leave them down below in the comment box. I do need to take a brief moment here to ask you please to check out my Patreon page. If you enjoy what I'm putting forth here, go and check out my Patreon page, which will be posted here. And if you can contribute anything, I would greatly appreciate it. Any amount would be much appreciated by me and by my family of screaming children out there on the deck. So thank you so much, and stay safe. God bless you all in this difficult and interesting time.